A 13-year-old boy sets up a simple lemonade stand. But one phone call changes everything. A privileged woman dials 911, unaware that she's about to start a fire she can't put out. When the cops show up, so does Shaquille O'Neal. Now, it's not just about lemonade. It's about power, privilege, and a test the whole world is watching. Because when you try to shut down the wrong kid, the internet strikes back. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The Florida sun hung heavy in the sky, stretching golden fingers over the quiet, manicured streets of Lakewood Heights. The neighborhood was a picture of suburban perfection. Pristine lawns, towering oak trees, and a stillness that made it clear the people here lived in comfort, untouched by the struggles beyond their gates. But today, something new disrupted the usual rhythm. A bright yellow lemonade stand, homemade but sturdy, stood proudly at the corner of Maple and Lexington. Hand-painted in bold black letters, Jarrett's Legendary Lemonade, $2 a cup. Behind the stand stood Jarrett Harris, a 13-year-old with a mind sharper than most adults and an energy that crackled like electricity. He wasn't just selling lemonade, he was building something bigger. His uncle, Shaquille O'Neal, had drilled into him the importance of hustle, of turning nothing into something. Jarrett had listened well. This wasn't just a weekend activity, it was a mission. His goal? Earn enough money to buy his first professional-grade basketball hoop. Sure, his uncle Shaq could buy him one in a heartbeat, but that wasn't the point. This was about proving himself. He wanted to earn it. Shaquille O'Neal was many things. An NBA legend, a businessman, a millionaire. But above all, he was real. Despite his wealth, he never let it change him. He still remembered where he came from, the struggles of his childhood, the sting of being doubted. It was why he pushed Jarrett to think bigger, work harder, and never let anyone tell him he didn't belong. From his car, parked a few blocks away, Shaq watched with quiet pride. His nephew stood tall, chin high, engaging every customer with a confident smile. Jarrett wasn't just selling lemonade. He was selling himself, his ambition, his hunger, his belief that he could build something from scratch. The first customers trickled in. Parents walking their kids, joggers cooling off, a few curious onlookers. Some bought out of kindness, others out of genuine admiration for the boy's hustle. Jarrett handled each sale with sharp efficiency, always thanking them, always making sure they left with a smile. But not everyone was impressed. From the porch of a house across the street, Karen Whitmore sat with a tight frown, gripping her iced coffee like it was a stress ball. She'd lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and never, not once, had she seen a lemonade stand pop up on this block. It just wasn't done here. She watched Jarrett with scrutinizing eyes. Something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way he took up space so confidently, or the fact that he didn't seem intimidated by his surroundings. Whatever it was, it made her uncomfortable. She glanced at her phone. Should she say something? Would that be overreacting? Karen wasn't racist, of course not. She had black friends, colleagues. She donated to charities that helped urban communities. But there were rules, unspoken ones. And right now, this boy, with his booming voice and relentless enthusiasm, was breaking them. Jarrett, oblivious to the brewing storm, was too busy working his magic. "Best lemonade in the city," he called out, as a silver BMW slowed down. The driver, a middle-aged man in a polo, hesitated, then chuckled and pulled over. Moments later, another sale. Another step closer to his goal. But as the day stretched on, the temperature wasn't the only thing rising. The subtle looks, the hesitant stares, the barely concealed frowns from a few passing neighbors. Jarrett could feel it, that unspoken discomfort. Most people were friendly, but some weren't. He'd seen it before, in small ways. The way clerks at expensive stores watched him too closely. The way some teachers assumed he couldn't afford certain things. He wasn't naive. But this was different. From the porch, Karen tapped her nails against her glass, frustration simmering beneath her skin. It wasn't just that he was there. It was how he was there. Too loud, too confident, too comfortable. She exhaled sharply and muttered under her breath. This wasn't right. And someone needed to do something about it. She picked up her phone. Shaq noticed the shift instantly. He'd spent years recognizing the silent language of discomfort, the tight smiles, the way people's eyes darted away when they saw something that didn't fit their world. He could tell the storm was coming. And Jarrett? He was too deep in the game to see it. As Shaq stepped out of his car, stretching his towering frame, he kept his eyes locked on his nephew. This was Jarrett's moment, his first real taste of what the world was like beyond the bubble of family, beyond the lessons taught in the comfort of home. He wasn't going to interfere. Not yet. Because in life, there are lessons you can't be told. You have to feel them. And Jarrett was about to feel one. A woman in yoga gear approached the stand, sunglasses perched on her nose. She hesitated, then pulled out a $5 bill. "Keep the change," she said with a kind smile. "Appreciate it." Jarrett grinned, pouring her a fresh cup. As she walked away, he allowed himself a moment to exhale. He was doing it. He was really doing it. But that small victory was short-lived. Because at that exact moment, two things happened. First, Karen ended her phone call. Her expression was cold, satisfied. Second, a police cruiser turned onto the street, blue and red lights flashing. Jarrett blinked. His hands tightened around the pitcher. For the first time all day, the air didn't feel light. It felt heavy. It felt wrong. Shaq clenched his jaw. Here we go. As the cop car rolled to a stop, a hush fell over the street. Conversations died. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Karen leaned back in her chair, a small smirk tugging at her lips. Jarrett swallowed hard as the door opened, and a uniformed officer stepped out. "Hey, kid," the cop said, his tone unreadable. "We got a call about your little setup here." Jarrett felt his stomach twist. He glanced around, looking for support. Some customers were still there. Some had already left. He glanced toward Shaq's car. His uncle was watching, waiting, letting him handle it. Jarrett took a breath, straightened his shoulders, and looked the officer in the eye. "Is there a problem, sir?" The officer exhaled, adjusting his belt. And just like that, the real test began. Karen Whitmore sat on her sun-bleached porch, her manicured fingers wrapped around a sweating glass of iced coffee. The ice cubes clinked against the glass as she took a slow sip, her eyes locked on the boy across the street. His lemonade stand, though small, stood out in the pristine neighborhood of Lakewood Heights, like a stain on an expensive white dress. It wasn't the stand itself that irritated her. It was him. Karen had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade. She prided herself on knowing every family, every couple that walked their purebred dogs, every child who rode their bikes on the cul-de-sacs. This boy? She didn't know him. And in a place like this, not knowing meant not belonging. She set her glass down on the glass-top patio table, squinting as she watched him interact with customers. His confidence unsettled her. He wasn't timid. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't acting like an outsider should. Karen didn't consider herself racist. Of course not. She had been to diversity seminars at her country club. She had neighbors who were black, colleagues at her part-time interior design firm who came from different backgrounds. But this felt different. The way he stood there, unbothered, collecting money, making money. Her fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest of her chair. It was just lemonade, but business was business. This neighborhood had rules, unspoken but well understood. If people like her wanted fresh squeezed lemonade, they went to the organic juice bar 3 blocks away, where drinks cost $7, where things were done properly. Not like this. She leaned forward, frowning. The tip jar was filling up. The boy was smiling. People were encouraging him. Karen's grip tightened. A neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, strolled by with her golden retriever, pausing at the stand. "Oh, how wonderful! What a hard-working young man!" Karen's jaw clenched. She had always considered herself and Mrs. Reynolds aligned. Same book club, same neighborhood association meetings, same understanding of how things should be. But now, Mrs. Reynolds was handing over a $5 bill, supporting this intrusion. Karen drummed her nails against the table. The boy wasn't just an anomaly. He was a disruption. As the afternoon wore on, the stand became more than just a lemonade stall. It became a gathering spot. People stopped to chat, to laugh. A few parents let their kids linger, enjoying the sight of a young entrepreneur at work. Karen's irritation simmered. This is not how this neighborhood works. She checked her phone. The Lakewood Heights neighborhood Facebook group was quiet. No one else seemed to be complaining. Was she the only one who saw the problem? Her husband, Greg, was inside, oblivious. She could already hear what he'd say if she brought it up. Leave it alone, Karen. It's just a kid selling lemonade. But Greg didn't understand. He didn't run this neighborhood. He didn't make sure everything was perfect. That was her job. Karen watched as a man in a Tesla pulled up, stepping out in tailored slacks and designer sunglasses. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a 20, handing it to the boy without hesitation. Her nostrils flared. A 20? For lemonade? She had a teenage son, Ryan. A good kid. A straight-A student. Well-mannered. On track for an Ivy League future. If he had set up a lemonade stand, she would have helped him get permits, designed professional signage, made sure everything was done correctly. But this boy? He had just shown up. No notice, no approval, just claimed his space. Karen bristled. She wasn't against entrepreneurship, not at all. But there were rules, permits, regulations. You couldn't just pop up on a sidewalk and start running a business. This wasn't some street market. She unlocked her phone and opened a browser. City ordinance permits, street vending. She tapped quickly, her mind racing. Karen's fingers hovered over her screen. There had to be something, some rule he was breaking. A shadow passed over her porch. She looked up to see Mark Douglas, a retired lawyer who lived 4 houses down. He was staring at the lemonade stand, too. "Afternoon, Karen," he said, stepping closer. She took her chance. "Mark, do you know if this neighborhood allows street vendors? Because I don't recall ever seeing one before." Mark glanced at the stand. "He's just a kid. I don't think it's a big deal." Karen forced a smile. "Oh, of course. But there are safety regulations, health codes, liability concerns. What if someone gets sick?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "From lemonade?" Karen shrugged. "You never know. And what if someone gets hurt? A table in the middle of the sidewalk, that's a hazard." Mark sighed. "Karen, I just think," she interrupted, voice light but firm, "that it's irresponsible to let something like this go unchecked. Today it's lemonade. Tomorrow it's, who knows, pop-up food stands, street peddlers. This is a residential area." Mark pursed his lips. "Are you actually worried about permits, or are you just uncomfortable with who's selling the lemonade?" Karen's face stiffened. "That's a ridiculous thing to say," she said smoothly. Mark held her gaze for a moment, then sighed. "Just let it go, Karen." He walked off before she could argue. Karen exhaled sharply, tapping her nails against her phone case. Let it go? Number. She would not let it go. She stared at the boy again. He was still there, standing tall, owning the space like it belonged to him. Customers kept coming. The tip jar kept filling. She had been the unofficial enforcer of Lakewood Heights for years. No one put up unapproved decorations. No one parked their cars on the street overnight. No one held garage sales without permission. And certainly no one set up unregistered businesses on the sidewalk. This wasn't about race. It wasn't even about the lemonade. It was about order. And she was about to restore it. She swiped to her contacts and pressed the familiar 3-digit number. 911. "Hello, yes," she said, voice carefully controlled. "I'd like to report a business operating without a permit in my neighborhood." The operator asked for details. "Well," Karen said, glancing across the street, watching as the boy laughed at something a customer said. "It's a young man selling drinks. I don't know if it's legal or safe." The operator asked if there was an immediate danger. Karen's lips pursed. "I wouldn't say danger, but you never know. It could be disruptive. Could cause issues. I just think someone should check it out." She could already see it in her mind. A polite but firm officer arriving, asking for a permit. The boy scrambling, realizing he didn't have one. The lemonade stand getting shut down. It wasn't personal. It was just how things worked. The operator confirmed that an officer would be dispatched. Karen leaned back in her chair, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. The boy would learn. There were rules for a reason. Karen Whitmore's fingers hovered over her phone screen. She could still hear Mark Douglas's words echoing in her mind. Are you actually worried about permits, or are you just uncomfortable with who's selling the lemonade? It was ridiculous, offensive even. This had nothing to do with race. This was about order. She had spent years making sure Lakewood Heights maintained its reputation. No unnecessary noise, no unsightly messes, no disruptions. She wasn't about to let one boy with a lemonade stand unravel that. Her nails tapped against the armrest of her porch chair. Across the street, the stand was thriving. Customers kept coming. A group of teenagers on bikes stopped to buy drinks, chatting and laughing as if the sidewalk was their personal lounge. A woman in tennis gear handed the boy a $10 bill and told him to keep the change. Karen's stomach twisted. It wasn't just that he was selling lemonade. It was that he was winning. And worst of all, no one else seemed to care. She glanced at her phone again. There was only one way to fix this. With a deep breath, Karen swiped to her keypad and dialed 911. The call connected on the first ring. 911? What's your emergency? Karen's voice was measured, dripping with concern but carefully controlled. Hi, I'd like to report a suspicious individual in my neighborhood. A pause. Then the dispatcher's voice. Can you describe the situation, ma'am? Karen's eyes stayed locked on the boy. He was laughing now, counting cash from the tip jar while another customer waited. It's a young man, she said, lowering her voice just enough to make it sound urgent. He set up a stand on the sidewalk, selling things. I don't know if he has a permit. It seems off. The dispatcher's tone remained neutral. Ma'am, is he causing a disturbance? Harassing anyone? Karen pursed her lips. That wasn't the point. I don't know, she said, adding just the right amount of hesitation. He's been here all day and people are gathering. It's making some of us uncomfortable. I don't want to assume anything, but you never know these days. He could be scamming people. There. She had planted the seed. The dispatcher asked for a location. Karen gave her address, making sure to emphasize that this was a gated community, a place where this kind of thing shouldn't happen. We'll send an officer to check it out, the dispatcher said. Karen exhaled, a wave of satisfaction washing over her. She had done the right thing. Across the street, Jarrett Harris had no idea what was coming. He was in the zone. His lemonade stand had never done this well before. People kept coming. He had already gone through 3 pitchers of lemonade, and the tip jar was so full he had to empty it into a shoebox under the table. A man in a business suit, probably coming home early from work, pulled up in a sleek Jaguar. He stepped out, glanced at the stand, and smirked. What do we have here? He asked. Jarrett grinned. The best lemonade you'll ever taste, sir. The man chuckled, pulling out a crisp $20 bill. I'll take 2, keep the change. Jarrett's stomach did a flip. He pocketed the bill, pouring the man's drinks with the smooth precision of a seasoned entrepreneur. This wasn't just a lemonade stand anymore. It was a business, and he was killing it. His uncle, Shaquille O'Neal, had always told him, if you're gonna do something, do it so well that they have no choice but to respect you. And today, people were respecting him. He glanced toward the parked SUV a few houses down. Shaq had been watching from a distance the whole time, not interfering, just observing. Jarrett knew what that meant. His uncle was testing him. This wasn't just about making money. It was about proving he could handle himself, that he could take an idea and turn it into something real. And so far, he was passing with flying colors. But while Jarrett focused on serving customers, he didn't see what was happening just down the block. A police cruiser had turned onto the street. It moved slowly, deliberately, the flashing lights off for now. Inside, Officer Paul Reed glanced at the dispatch notes. Suspicious individual. Possible unauthorized vending. He sighed. He'd been on the force for 12 years, and he had seen real problems. This question mark. This didn't sound like one. Still, a call was a call. As he pulled closer, he spotted the stand. A young black boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing behind a neatly arranged lemonade table. A line of customers. Laughter. friendly conversation. He felt a familiar knot form in his chest. He had seen this scene before, a harmless situation that turned into something bigger because someone, somewhere, felt uncomfortable. Reed turned to his partner, a younger cop named Daniels. "We go in easy, no assumptions." Daniels nodded, and with that the cruiser rolled to a stop. The instant the police car pulled up, the energy on the street shifted. The laughter quieted. Conversations stalled. The air suddenly felt too thick, too heavy. Jarrett looked up, confused. His hands tightened around the lemonade pitcher. The back of his neck prickled. He wasn't doing anything wrong. So why were the police here? Karen watched from her porch, a satisfied smirk creeping across her face. This was how things were supposed to be: controlled, regulated, kept in check. Officer Reed stepped out of the cruiser, adjusting his belt. His partner followed, scanning the scene. Jarrett forced himself to stay calm. But deep inside, a seed of doubt took root. Because he knew, he had always known, that being right didn't always mean being safe. The officer approached, stopping just short of the stand. "Hey there, kid," he said, voice neutral. "You mind telling me what's going on here?" Jarrett swallowed, glancing at the customers. Some looked concerned. Others started stepping back. Even the ones who had been friendly didn't want to get involved. Shaq, still parked in his SUV, leaned forward. His face was unreadable. Jarrett turned back to the officer, standing his ground. "I'm selling lemonade, sir," he said, keeping his voice even. "Is there a problem?" Officer Reed sighed, running a hand over his chin. He didn't want to be here. But now, he had no choice. He glanced toward Karen's house. He could see her, pretending not to stare, pretending she wasn't the one who had made this happen. He exhaled. And then, in the calmest voice he could muster, he asked the question that would change everything. "Do you have a permit?" The street went silent. Karen smiled. Jarrett's heart dropped. Shaq's hand curled into a fist on the steering wheel. And in that moment, the young hustler realized this wasn't about lemonade anymore. It was about something much bigger. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The sound of tires rolling to a slow stop sent an eerie hush over the street. A police cruiser, its blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of parked cars, pulled up right in front of Jarrett Harris's lemonade stand. The laughter died. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. A few people stepped back instinctively, as if not wanting to be too close when things went sideways. The ones who had been casually chatting just moments ago now looked hesitant, unsure of what to do. Jarrett's grip on the lemonade pitcher tightened. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, as the two officers stepped out of the cruiser, adjusting their belts, scanning the scene with practiced caution, he felt a tightness in his chest. Because deep down, he knew. This wasn't about lemonade anymore. Officer Paul Reed took the lead, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a face that had seen far too much. His partner, Officer Daniels, younger and newer to the force, trailed just behind, scanning the scene with less certainty. Reed's gaze landed on Jarrett first. Not the stand, not the customers, just him. For a long second, he didn't speak. He just looked. Jarrett recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in a store once, when a security guard trailed him through the aisles, even though he hadn't touched a thing. The same look a teacher had given him when he had raised his hand one too many times in class. It was a look that said, "Explain yourself." Reed finally spoke. His voice was calm, but firm. "Where's your permit, kid?" Jarrett squared his shoulders. His uncle had always told him, "You don't have to fear anybody when you know you're right." So he didn't back down. He met the officer's gaze and said clearly, "I didn't know I needed one." A flicker of something passed over Reed's face. A test. A moment of calculation. Jarrett could see him trying to figure out if this was a kid who would be intimidated or a kid who would push back. From across the street, Karen Whitmore watched from her porch, pretending to be absorbed in her phone. But the slight smirk on her lips gave her away. She was enjoying this. Then, a soft chime of a phone recording. Someone in the crowd, a woman in sunglasses, standing near a stroller, had started filming. Another person pulled out their phone. Then another. Reed noticed. His jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they had expected. A couple of people watching? Sure. But cameras? This was about to be public. A few houses down, inside a sleek black SUV, Shaquille O'Neal leaned forward, watching the scene unfold. He knew this moment was coming. He could have stepped out right now, walked over, and shut this whole thing down in seconds. But he didn't. Because this was Jarrett's fight first. A young black man learning, in real time, what it meant to exist in a world that didn't always want you to win. Shaq's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. He was ready to move the second things escalated. But for now, he watched. From her porch, Karen finally made her move. She stood up, adjusting her crisp white blouse, and walked toward the scene with an air of authority. She wasn't scared. The cops were here now. She could say whatever she wanted. "I was the one who called," she announced, her voice carrying just enough faux concern to sound reasonable. Reed turned to her. "What seems to be the issue, ma'am?" Karen folded her arms, tilting her head toward the stand. "I just found it strange," she said smoothly. "He's been here all day. No supervision, handling money. I don't know if the drinks are even safe. I mean, you never know, right?" Jarrett's hands curled into fists. His lemonade was safer than the overpriced smoothies she probably drank at her country club. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but before he could, a voice cut through the tension. "Ma'am," Officer Reed said, shifting his stance slightly. "Are you saying there was a complaint about the quality of the lemonade?" Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected to be questioned. "No, I'm just saying," she said, her voice taking on a slightly more defensive edge. "Shouldn't there be rules? I mean, if anyone can just set up a business anywhere, what's next? People selling things on every corner?" Officer Reed's lips pressed into a thin line. He'd seen this exact situation play out too many times. He had a choice here. He could push this further. He could make this kid pack up, give Karen what she wanted, or he could let this kid be. He glanced at the crowd, the phones, the expectant eyes. Karen was waiting for validation. Jarrett was waiting for justice. And Shaquille O'Neal was waiting for an excuse to step in. Reed took a breath and finally said, "Selling lemonade in a residential neighborhood without a permit isn't a criminal offense." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" The officer turned back to Jarrett. "Kid, you should probably look into getting a permit. Technically, there are rules for this kind of thing. But in this case," he glanced back at Karen, "there's no real problem here." Karen's smugness faltered. "But I called because—" Reed turned to her. "And we responded. But there's no law being broken." Karen's lips parted, but for once she had nothing to say. From his SUV, Shaquille O'Neal finally opened the door. Every head snapped in his direction. The sheer size of him was enough to make people stop breathing for half a second. He strode forward, cool and calm as ever, stepping beside his nephew, placing a massive hand on Jarrett's shoulder. "You good?" Shaq asked, voice low but powerful. Jarrett nodded, but his jaw was still tight. Karen's face went pale. She knew now. She knew exactly who she had been messing with. Officer Reed exhaled, nodding at Shaq in quiet recognition. "Sir." Shaq gave him a polite nod back. "Officer." The message in their exchange was clear. This was over. The crowd didn't cheer, but the energy had shifted. Karen took a small step back, realizing there was no winning this. One by one, people started speaking up. "I don't see the problem. He's just a kid selling lemonade. Seems like a waste of police time." Karen's face burned. She turned quickly and walked back toward her house, keeping her head down. She could already feel the weight of eyes watching her. The police left soon after, the tension finally breaking. Shaq turned to Jarrett, his voice calm. "You handled that like a pro." Jarrett exhaled, his hands still trembling slightly. Shaq clapped him on the back. "Welcome to the real world, kid." Jarrett nodded, but he wasn't just frustrated. He was motivated. Because now he wasn't just selling lemonade. Now he had a mission. Jarrett stood behind his lemonade stand, his fists clenched at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears. The officers had backed off, for now, but Karen Whitmore still stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes burning with irritation. And then, it happened. A sleek black SUV rolled onto the street, moving deliberately slow, its engine a low growl beneath the weight of what was coming. It didn't belong to the neighborhood's usual lineup of spotless Range Rovers and polished Teslas. This was different. The moment it came to a halt, everything changed. Heads turned. A hush rippled through the crowd. Even the officers who had been holding firm in their authority shifted ever so slightly. Because they knew. They knew who was inside. The SUV door swung open with a smooth, calculated movement, and then he stepped out. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq. A mountain of a man, towering over everyone. His presence swallowed the space the second he unfolded from the vehicle, his broad shoulders eclipsing the sun, his sheer size making everything around him seem suddenly smaller. The street had never felt this quiet before. Karen squinted, her lips pressing into a thin line as if trying to place him. She could tell, just from the way the officers straightened their postures, that this wasn't just some random guy. But she didn't recognize him immediately. And that was her first mistake. Officer Reed cleared his throat, his stance softened, not fearful but aware. This wasn't some overprotective uncle or a neighborhood parent coming to smooth things over. This was Shaquille O'Neal, a global icon, a man whose very name carried weight. Reed exhaled and took a careful step forward. Mr. O'Neal Daniels, the younger officer, blinked, realization finally clicking. He whispered something to Reed, who gave a slight nod in response. Karen, still oblivious, scoffed. "Who does this guy think he is?" she muttered under her breath. Shaq said nothing. He didn't have to. He walked forward with a calm, controlled energy. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't threatening. But he was making one thing very clear. This was his moment now. Shaq stopped beside Jarrett, resting a hand on his nephew's shoulder. The boy's body was still rigid, still buzzing from the confrontation. Shaq could feel it. The frustration, the humiliation, the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Jarrett wasn't just upset about the cops. He was upset about what this meant, what it always meant. Shaq took a slow breath, then turned his gaze toward Reed. "I'm gonna need you to explain to me what's happening here." His voice was calm. Too calm. Reed, to his credit, kept his composure. He glanced at Karen before responding. "We received a call about unauthorized vending," he said carefully. "Technically, selling without a permit is against local ordinances." Shaq nodded slowly, as if considering the words. "And how often do y'all get calls like this?" Reed hesitated. "Not often." "Uh-huh." The silence stretched between them. Shaq's expression didn't change, but his eyes had a weight to them. A quiet, undeniable challenge. And that's when Karen finally stepped in. She cleared her throat and squared her shoulders, forcing confidence into her posture. "I don't see why this is such a big deal," she said, waving a hand toward the lemonade stand. "There are rules for a reason." Shaq turned his head slightly, giving her just enough attention to make her flinch. He didn't speak. Not yet. Karen crossed her arms tighter. "We can't just have people setting up businesses on the sidewalk whenever they feel like it." "People," Shaq repeated, his voice a low rumble. "You mean kids?" Karen's face twitched. "It's not about that. It's about fairness." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "Fairness?" Karen took a breath, realizing, too late, that she had walked into something bigger than she was prepared for. Shaq turned his eyes back to Reed. "Let me ask you something, officer." Reed straightened. "Yes, sir." Shaq's voice remained steady, but the undertone was unshakable. "If this was a white kid selling lemonade, would we be standing here right now?" A ripple went through the onlookers. Some exchanged glances. Others murmured. A woman near the back cleared her throat. "I mean, it's a fair question." Another man in a polo shirt shifted uncomfortably. "Come to think of it, my daughter sold lemonade last summer. No one said a thing." Karen's jaw tightened. "That is completely unfair. You're making this about something it's not." Shaq's eyes locked onto hers. And finally, he spoke the words that ended her argument. "No," he said, his tone quiet but powerful. You already did that when you made the call. Officer Reed inhaled deeply. He had been a cop long enough to know when a situation was lost. There was nothing more to be done here. No crime had been committed. No harm had been caused. And Shaquille O'Neal had made his point without raising his voice once. Reed gave a nod. We're done here. Daniels exhaled, relieved, and turned toward Karen. Ma'am, if you don't have any further concerns, we'll be on our way. Karen's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had nothing left. The officers gave Jared a brief nod and headed back toward their cruiser. As the police car pulled away, Shaq finally looked down at Jarrett. The boy still looked tense, his young face twisted with anger and something deeper. Shaq knelt slightly so they were eye level. You good? Jarrett swallowed, then nodded. But Shaq could tell. This had changed him. He gave his nephew's shoulder a squeeze. You handled that well. Jarrett exhaled. Did I? Shaq nodded. You stayed standing. That's all that matters. Karen had slunk back toward her porch, but she could still hear them. Shaq didn't look at her as he spoke, but the words weren't for Jarrett alone. They always want to see us fold. We don't. Karen flinched. She turned, disappearing into her house without another word. The moment lingered, thick with meaning. Then, slowly, life returned to the street. A few people clapped Jarrett on the back. Someone whispered, "Good for you, kid." And Shaquille O'Neal. He simply stood, towering over everything. A reminder that power didn't have to be loud. Sometimes, it just had to exist. And when it did, there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Karen Whitmore stood on her perfectly paved driveway, arms crossed, a smug expression creeping onto her face. The cops had come. The stand had been questioned. And now, standing before her, was the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal, a man who clearly thought his presence alone would change the rules. She wasn't intimidated. Not really. Well, she said, tilting her head slightly, her voice taking on that polite but sharp tone she always used when shutting down disagreements at HOA meetings. I was just looking out for the neighborhood. Shaq didn't react right away. He let the words hang in the humid air, let them settle like dust before the storm. Then, in a voice so low and steady, it made the silence around him feel heavy, he said, No, you were looking out for yourself. Karen's smirk faltered for half a second before she pulled her shoulders back. That's ridiculous. Shaq shook his head once. You weren't worried about the neighborhood. You were worried about control. The words landed, not loud, not aggressive, but unshakable. Karen's fingers curled around her elbow as she folded her arms tighter. Her gaze darted to the officers for backup, but they didn't step in. They were watching now, just like everyone else. Her ego kicked in, sharp and stubborn. She wasn't going to be made to look like the villain here. She let out a dry chuckle. Rules are rules. He can't just set up anywhere. Shaq's eyes didn't waver, didn't blink. And you think that's really what this is about? He asked. Karen opened her mouth, ready to fire back, but then Shaq did something that shifted the entire energy of the street. He turned his massive frame away from her completely and looked at the cops. Shaq's gaze locked onto Officer Reed. He didn't glare, didn't narrow his eyes. He just asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Would you be here if this was a white kid? The street went still. The weight of the question sank into every sidewalk crack, every manicured hedge, every front porch where neighbors pretended not to listen. Officer Reed, to his credit, didn't react right away. He inhaled sharply through his nose, exhaled just as slowly. Daniels, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably beside him. Because there was no easy answer to that. And every single person here already knew the truth. Reed's jaw flexed. We respond to calls, sir. Shaq nodded. Uh-huh. And if a white kid had been standing here selling lemonade, would you have still gotten that call? No answer, because they both knew. Karen knew it too, but she wasn't about to admit it. Instead, she scoffed. Oh, come on. This is absurd. Shaq didn't even look at her, didn't need to. He kept his focus on the officers, on the authority figures who had let this happen. If he was white, Shaq said, this wouldn't have been a problem. No one would have called. No one would have cared. You wouldn't be standing here right now, asking a 13-year-old for a permit to sell a cup of lemonade. Daniel's lips parted, like he wanted to say something, wanted to deny it. But he didn't, because he couldn't, because they all knew. Karen, still standing her ground, let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I can't believe this. You're making this about race? Shaq's gaze finally slid back to her. She regretted speaking immediately. This was about race the second you picked up the phone. Karen's arms tightened around her torso. That is not true. Shaq took a slow step forward, not threatening, not aggressive, just present. Then tell me, he said, voice still steady, why you really called. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. The air shifted. The neighbors who had been quietly watching moved just a little closer. Some of them had been on her side before. Now they weren't so sure. The power of silence Shaq didn't push further. He didn't yell, didn't demand an apology. He just stood there, watching, waiting. And the longer Karen stood there without an answer, the clearer it became that she didn't have one. The realization crept into her expression, turning her irritation into something else. Something dangerously close to guilt. But Karen wasn't the kind to admit when she was wrong. So instead, she let out a sharp breath and turned away, waving her hand dismissively. This is ridiculous, she muttered, storming back toward her house. But she didn't go inside right away. Because now the entire street was looking at her differently, and she could feel it. Shaq turned back to Jarrett, who had been silent, watching every second of this exchange. His nephew was still standing tall, but there was something behind his eyes. Something deeper. Shaq saw it, felt it, and he knew what needed to happen next. This ain't over, he said, clapping a hand on Jarrett's shoulder. We just getting started. Jarrett exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening just a little. And for the first time since the cops showed up, he believed it. The moment the police car pulled away, the street slowly exhaled. Conversations picked back up, neighbors exchanged glances, and Jarrett Harris stood behind his lemonade stand, still gripping the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs. Shaquille O'Neal remained beside him, a steady presence, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the stand. The tension was still there, hanging like humidity in the Florida air. But something had shifted. Power had changed hands. And then, the moment that would change everything happened. A soft ding echoed from someone's phone. Then another. And another. Karen Whitmore had no idea what was coming. The woman in sunglasses, the one who had started recording when the cops first arrived, lowered her phone and smirked. It's already up, she muttered, half to herself. Another voice, a man standing near the sidewalk, let out a small laugh. Oh, this is gonna be everywhere. And they weren't wrong. By the time Karen stormed back into her house, the damage was already done. The video had hit social media, and it was spreading like wildfire. It started small. Someone on Twitter posted the clip with a simple caption. Karen calls the cops on black kid selling lemonade. Then Shaq pulls up. A few retweets. A few comments. Then, boom. Within an hour, the video had hundreds of thousands of views. Another tweet. This one sharper. The way Shaq completely dismantled this woman without raising his voice once. A masterclass. People weren't just watching, they were choosing sides. And Karen was losing. By the time the local news station caught wind of the video, the internet had already done its job. Facebook groups picked it up. Reddit threads dissected every second. Instagram pages flooded with memes. One of the most viral clips was a freeze frame of Karen's face when she realized who Shaq was. The caption? When you call the cops on the wrong lemonade stand. The internet had officially named her. Lemonade Karen. And there was no escaping it. It didn't take long for the big names to notice. A famous rapper tweeted, "Little man was just trying to get his hustle on and they called the cops. This is why we need to support black businesses. Someone get me in touch with this kid." A billionaire CEO retweeted the video. "If this young entrepreneur is reading this, DM me. I want to invest in your future." Even NBA stars chimed in. One former player. This is why Shaq is the GOAT, protecting his people, standing up for the next generation. Mad respect. And then, the thing that sealed the deal, Shaq himself reposted the video, adding only 2 words. Watch this. Millions did. Jarrett's mom was the first to notice. Her phone started buzzing uncontrollably. Calls, texts, notifications piling up so fast she barely had time to breathe. Someone had started a GoFundMe for Jarrett's lemonade business. It had been up for 20 minutes. It had already hit $50,000. By the end of the night, over $250,000. People weren't just donating money, they were sending messages. Keep going, kid. We see you. Don't let anyone stop you. Next time, open a whole lemonade shop. Jarrett had gone from just trying to buy a basketball hoop to becoming the face of something bigger. Karen Whitmore sat in her living room, staring at her phone. Her notifications wouldn't stop. Hundreds of comments, messages, calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Some were from friends, some were not. One email simply read, "You got shacked." Her name was trending. Her social media had been found. Her past Facebook posts were being dug up. People were looking into her job. There were already calls for her to be fired. She tried to ignore it. She tried to tell herself it would blow over. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't going away. The news stations picked up the story the next morning. Some outlets tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. Others didn't hold back. One segment aired the clip, then cut to a panelist shaking his head. This is a classic case of power meeting privilege. That boy wasn't breaking the law. He was just breaking Karen's illusion of control. Another news anchor put it bluntly. If this was a white child, would Karen have called the police? Be honest with yourselves. The truth was out there now, and Karen? She had nowhere to hide. Jarrett sat at his kitchen table staring at the GoFundMe page. The numbers kept going up. His mom, still in shock, rubbed her temples. Baby, this is crazy. Shaq, leaning against the counter, just smiled. That's what happens when you stand your ground. Jarrett exhaled. He wasn't just a kid with a lemonade stand anymore. He had a platform and a choice. Use this moment just for himself, or turn it into something bigger. By the end of the week, Karen had lost her job. The company she worked for released a statement, distancing themselves from her actions. She tried to apologize, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. People weren't buying it. And the worst part? She wasn't in control anymore. A week later, people had moved on to new stories. But Karen, she was still Lemonade Karen. And Jarrett? He was already planning his next business move, because this was just the beginning. The world had seen the video. They had watched Karen Whitmore call the cops on a 13-year-old boy selling lemonade. They had witnessed Shaquille O'Neal stepping in and turning the moment into something bigger than just a neighborhood dispute. And now it wasn't just a story. It was a movement. Jarrett Harris sat at his kitchen table, his phone lighting up with notifications every few seconds. The GoFundMe page had crossed $300,000 overnight. News stations wanted interviews. Brands were reaching out. A local beverage company had already emailed an offer. We'd love to collaborate with you on a special edition lemonade flavor. A national grocery chain had followed up with, let's talk about getting Jarrett's legendary lemonade in our stores. His hands shook as he scrolled. It didn't feel real. His mom, still overwhelmed, stood behind him, arms crossed, shaking her head in disbelief. Baby, this is crazy. Shaq, leaning against the counter, just chuckled. Nah, this is what happens when you own your story. And Jarrett was starting to understand. This wasn't just about lemonade anymore. This was about something much bigger. By the end of the week, Jarrett had done 3 interviews, 1 local news segment, 1 Zoom call with a major morning show, and 1 sit-down with a popular YouTube business channel, where the host called him the youngest entrepreneur to turn a Karen call into a cash empire. His lemonade stand, once a small table on a quiet sidewalk, was now a national sensation. People wanted in, investors, sponsors, activists, celebrities. Even an NBA player messaged him, if you ever want to expand, let me know. We got resources. And Jarrett? He wasn't just taking money, he was making plans. He told his mom, I don't just want a lemonade stand. I want a brand, Shaq grinned. That's my boy. While Jarrett was on his way up, Karen Whitmore was sinking fast. Her name was still trending. Her inbox was a mess, messages from strangers, former colleagues, even distant family members telling her she had embarrassed herself. Her boss had let her go. Her neighbors were avoiding her. And now? Now, the news wanted to hear from her. She had ignored them at first, hoping things would blow over. But when a major network sent a formal request, she saw her chance. She would fix this. Or at least she thought she could. Karen sat in front of a news camera, posture stiff but composed. The interviewer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, didn't waste time. Karen, the video of you calling the police on a child's lemonade stand has been viewed over 50 million times. People say this was about race. Do you disagree? Karen forced a smile. I think people misunderstood my intentions. I was simply looking out for the neighborhood. The interviewer didn't blink. By calling the police on a child? Karen's smile faltered. I just meant there are rules and… Would you have called if it was a white child? A long pause. Karen opened her mouth, closed it. The silence was louder than anything she could have said, because everyone already knew the answer. Karen had a choice. She could keep defending herself, keep insisting she was just following the rules, or she could do something different. That night, as she scrolled through article after article dragging her name, she stopped at one headline that hit her differently: how a kid took hate and turned it into a business. And for the first time since this started, she wondered, had she really lost? Or had she just been wrong? 3 days later, Jarrett's mom got a phone call from a blocked number. She almost didn't answer. But something told her she should. The voice on the other end? Karen. She wanted to talk. And for the first time since it all began, she didn't sound so sure of herself. She sounded like someone who finally understood what she had done. The question was it too late? Jarrett Harris sat in the back of his uncle's SUV, staring out the window as the city lights flickered past. It had been weeks since the lemonade stand incident, and life had changed in ways he never imagined. He wasn't just some kid hustling to buy a basketball hoop anymore. Now he was a brand, a name people recognized, a young entrepreneur with national support, a growing business, and an inbox full of opportunities he never saw coming. And yet, he wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because there was something about all of this that still didn't sit right. He had won. But why did it still feel like a fight? Shaq drove in silence, letting the hum of the road settle between them. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Jarrett would start asking the right questions. Finally, the kid spoke. This wasn't about lemonade, was it? Shaq smiled to himself, keeping his eyes on the road. Took you long enough. Jarrett exhaled, leaning back against the seat. I mean, I get it. The money, the attention, the business offers. It's all great. But if I was just another kid selling lemonade, none of this would have happened. Shaq nodded. Yup. Jarrett turned toward him. So what was it really about? Shaq pulled up to a red light and finally glanced over. Power. Jarrett frowned. What do you mean? They'll always test you, Shaq said simply. The key is making sure they never win. Jarrett let the words sink in. The lemonade stand had been a test. Karen had been a test. The cops, the internet, the people watching, waiting to see if he'd fold. All of it had been a test. And somehow, he had passed. Shaq pulled the SUV into a private parking lot and killed the engine. Come on, he said. I want to show you something. Jarrett followed him into a massive warehouse, the kind of place that had the bones of something important. The lights flicked on, revealing an empty space with nothing but potential. This is yours, Shaq said. Jarrett's head snapped toward him. What? Shaq smirked. Well, technically it's a business investment, but this is where you take control. Jarrett turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. What am I supposed to do with it? Shaq clapped a hand on his nephew's shoulder. Whatever you want, but make it count. The next few weeks moved fast. With Shaq's help and the flood of donations still rolling in, Jarrett put a team together. He met with designers, marketers, and people who knew how to turn an idea into something real. And then, just a month after everything started, he made his biggest announcement yet. A press conference, cameras flashing, reporters ready to see what the kid would do next. Jarrett stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and said, "I'm launching the Harris Foundation for Young Entrepreneurs." Silence. Then, a wave of applause. It wasn't just about lemonade anymore. This was about helping other kids who had ideas but no resources. This was about making sure that when the next Jarrett Harris tried to start something, no one could shut them down. A scholarship fund, a business incubator for young hustlers, a legacy. And the best part? It was only the beginning. After the press conference, Shaq stood off to the side, watching his nephew handle questions like a pro. A kid who had once just wanted to buy a basketball hoop was now changing the game entirely. Shaq smiled. The future had just gotten a little stronger, and he had a feeling that this was only the first chapter. Some moments spark conversations. Others spark change. What happened to Jarrett isn't just his story. It's a reflection of a world where hustle meets bias and privilege meets truth. The real question? What do you do when you see it happen? Ignore it, or turn it into something bigger. Because the next time someone tries to shut down the wrong dreamer, they might just build an empire instead.